Hi, I'm Jessica Lauren Walton, and this is my interview corner. If there is a cool story in the security field or just something that I think is going to be helpful for my fellow professionals, then I want to talk about it. To learn more about the work I do as a writer or to sign up for my newsletter, you can go ahead and visit my blog at www.jessicawaltonwriter.com. Today's guests are Dan Jarvis and Nick Davis, who sometimes like to refer to themselves as the Anxiety Guys. They are both U.S. military veterans who are very open about their personal stories and what brought them to the work they do today in cutting-edge PTSD treatments. So let's head in there and talk to Dan and Nick. Thank you for joining me. And of course, thank you for your service protecting our country. So Dan, I know you served in the U.S. military, including deployment to Afghanistan back in 2011. You've experienced the intensity of combat and suffered from PTSD as a result, which I know led you to the work that you're doing today. Nick, you spent several years in the Air Force. So helping your fellow veterans is a big passion of yours. It sounds like 220 is the perfect fit for you. So just jumping in, why don't you guys just give me a little snapshot of your military background and what led you to 220 today? We could just start with Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Appreciate it. So I deployed to Iraq in 06, 07 for a 15-month deployment. And then I also deployed it in 2011, 2012 to Afghanistan. Between that, I was a drill sergeant for the United States Army. September actually was March of 2013. After my Afghanistan deployment, I was actively suicidal. A few things happened to prevent that. One was when I was looking at that rifle, I heard the kids in the apartment above me, which kind of took me out of that. I didn't want to do something stupid that would hurt a child. And then the next morning, I got a phone call. One of the soldiers that was in the platoon I had just come out of had shot and killed himself that same night. So I always say Corey Smathers saved my life. Unfortunately, it's when he took his own. And then I just continued to struggle silently. No one knew that I was struggling. No one knew that I had, post-traumatic stress. At the time, I didn't even know I had it. I didn't know what I was experiencing. I just knew my emotions were all over the place. I couldn't sleep, nightmares, night sweats. I would self-medicate just to sleep. I would drink alcohol just to go to sleep. September 11th of 2014, the United States Army medically retired me. So I took one uniform off and I went and put another uniform on. So I went back into law enforcement, worked for a sheriff's office in Central Florida, did that for a couple more years. And definitely a young person's profession, chasing kids around the woods at 42 and having combat injuries didn't seem like, the thing I needed to do anymore. And it wasn't until I took that uniform off that everything kind of came back, because it was kind of ironic. When I was in a uniform working actively, I was fine, because now I realize it's because first responders by profession operate in the fight or flight. So we feel normal in that environment. It's when we get removed from that environment that the idle mind takes over and all of those thoughts start bombarding you and coming back to you. And, my ex-wife at the time, we were married. She's like, you've got to go get some help because I don't know what to do with you. And that's when I was like, well, I don't have a badge and I don't have a security clearance. So I went to the VA and, sought treatment. And, it took me a while. They didn't even tell me my diagnosis until I was starting the therapy with them. And I was doing exposure therapy. And what I found in that was, there was a big chasm that I kind of fell into. I fell through the cracks. The VA had canceled an appointment on me. After my second appointment, I couldn't get in for 4 weeks. I would go back again. They canceled the next appointment after that. I couldn't get in for 8 weeks. And that was kind of the end of my experience with the VA. So I decided to look for alternative treatments. As there's got to be a better way. And I met Nick at an event in Tampa. And there were some pretty interesting folks there. And that's when, the guy that was leading the event says, Dan, you look like you have something you want to say. And that's the aha moment I had. And I said, 220. And they're like, what's that? I says, we're going to take 22 veteran suicides a day to zero. Don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to do it. And that was the creation, after that weekend. I incorporated in the state of Florida, started putting the nonprofit paperwork together, and then we started looking for alternative treatments. And it was not until August of that year, 2018, that I went through an alternative treatment that was a paradigm shift, like not symptomatic on trauma anymore. And it's hard to explain that and I didn't even have a clue that was even a possibility, because, trauma is something that's not unique to the military. Probably my biggest traumatic events was when I was 11 years old, things when I had no control in life. And so the nonprofit, started focusing on how to heal trauma. And we ended up developing our own processes to actually train other veterans and other first responders. Nick came onto the mission very, very short into 22-0, helped us get the organization started at the beginning. And, ever since, we've been on this journey trying to help our veterans and first responders, because I've worked in both fields. And the success is unbelievably amazing for the people that will do the work and actually go through the processes. They all heal, every one of them.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that story. Nick, on to you. Tell me a little bit about your military experience and what led you to 22-0.
I'd probably say my childhood led me to 22-0 as much as my military experience. My time in the service, I went in 97, got out in 01. And in that time frame, I deployed twice to the Middle East, once to Saudi Arabia, once to Kuwait, doing Operation Southern Watch. And my worst trauma, my worst stuff was actually civilian life. It wasn't while I was in the military. And when I met Dan, I had been for years wanting to give back. I'm a big contribute person. I like to help others. Met him. I could tell he was somebody of high integrity and really putting others before himself, service before self. And when he spoke 22-0 into existence and known that I had something small to offer as far as helping get that process started, and then joining the board, and then him and I just love what we get to do to heal people and watching the rapid transformations. Having people tell you, I was going to kill myself last night, but then I worked with you and I'm smiling and I'm happy. And we have hundreds and hundreds of those kinds of testimonials. I think that's what really lit me up. And going through things like divorce as a child, and then divorce as an adult, and losing everything financially, losing your job, your own income, bankrupt. So I'd been built up, stripped down, built up again. And for me, the emotional toll that can take, and everybody's trauma or situations or life situations can be different. I think what Dan and I are really trying to do at its core is educate others on what trauma really is and negative emotions really are, and how they affect you from I don't want to say a layman standpoint, but for me as a financial planner professionally, that's something I've done for 10 years. Somebody can sit across from me and I start talking numbers and investments and, beta, alpha, and you throw out all these, and you see the eyes gloss over, right? I think that's something that Dan and I are extremely good at, is we explain things at a level that people that makes sense. I can almost see my brain and why it's doing that, and helping others know that this is a neurological issue that can be disconnected without discussing events that you've been through. So the common theme that we have found to be 90-something% true. I don't have the true statistics on this. Almost all of us that served, or first responders or veterans, have some form of childhood trauma. And it might not be a massive traumatic event in childhood, but it could be traumatic to that 6-year-old, 8-year-old in that moment. Mom and dad got in a huge fight. You were scared. That's the building block. Trauma builds and builds over time. And then you go and deploy like Dan did, and you see heavy combat. My combat time was not engaged with enemies, but it was over there. So he's actually directly engaged in it. And then you come back here in law enforcement, but it's really all building on that 11, 12-year-old event, and building for me in an early childhood event. So the unfortunate part, there's a lot of civilians out there. There's more civilians than there are people who are in a uniform suffering from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. And it can be healed. And getting that word out is not easy, and letting people understand, as unbelievable as it is, you can heal these issues without discussing details of what you've gone through. And if you don't believe us, that's cool, but do a session with us, and the proof is in the pudding. The people that we heal are some of the most amazing people out there. So I think their testimonials are what you should listen to, not what we have to say.
It's interesting that you both brought up childhood experiences. I never really thought about it before until I met Dr. Backwee, Dr. Phil Backwee. That's how we wound up getting connected, right? And he was talking about ACE surveys, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experience surveys. And he said, in his experience, treating people just like you, he's not just with veterans, he's also with law enforcement, the first responder community as well. And he said approximately 60% of the professionals coming into this particular field, right, are suffering from some kind of adverse childhood experience or more than one. And so it's just interesting because, it's something obviously that is driving people, whether they realize it or not, but it also kind of creates this inherent vulnerability that could make you more susceptible to certain mental health issues or PTSD people are not aware of. And something else I just wanted to mention was interesting. I also recently interviewed Kate Kuzminski. She is, I think, the director of veteran affairs at the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. And she made this very interesting point that when the U.S. military had a mandatory draft, the ACE scores, right, were like very similar to the rest of the population, which makes the civilian population, which makes sense. She said once it became an all volunteer military, that's when the ACE scores went up. So clearly people who come into not everybody, of course, I'm not somebody who had a traumatic childhood at all. I had other reasons for coming to the security field, but I just think that's very interesting. And I appreciate you guys sharing, that aspect of your life as well. So my next question is really, I just want to dig into the work you do. I want to know more about 220. You mentioned, I was going to ask you where the name came from, and I think you answered that before, but yeah, I just want to understand, what are you doing? Tell me a little bit more about your therapies and why do they work?
So just to give a little explanation, the human brain will observe about 70,000 images in a day. And every once in a while, it's like, oh, that's important. Right? The traumatic event occurs. It's fight, flight, or freeze. And you're hitting the gas pedal to push through that objective. And then your foot stays on the gas pedal, right? That's your amygdala stays active. Nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, emotional dysregulation. And what we do is we found, and these are not new treatments, they've been around for a while. We've modeled some processes that were developed in the early 1980s using visual guided imagery exercises. So what we would do is we would put memories at the beginning and the end of the event, actual memories, and turn those black and white. And then what happens is we'd watch a disassociation event of that. So you're looking at yourself watching a movie. You're not actually in it. And then there's a piece where you're rewinding, because when the emotion's active, it's malleable. We can change the state of the emotion. We don't touch the memories. The memories never change. What happens is the feelings attached to it. So that neural pathway that's connected, on the disconnect, the amygdala will release that pathway. And then the pathway between the emotions and the memory, the visual, will release. And that's a process called memory reconsolidation. So you're putting your memory in the proper context. And what it's doing is it's forcing you into a parasympathetic response, which allows you to hit your REM sleep cycles. And it's in the REM sleep that the brain starts processing and moving. You get the rapid eye movement, and that's when it's moving files around in your brain, and it's moving emotions back to your hippocampus. It's moving memories into your cerebellum, your long-term memory. And then the next thing you do, you wake up and you're refreshed, you're energized. You don't feel that visceral gut feeling about that traumatic memory. You actually can look at it, think about it, talk about it, and not get emotional. And then the other piece on the emotions, like say it's somebody has anxiety or an anger problem. Again, we find the root where it started. Majority of the time, it's in childhood. And then we activate that trigger, and then we disassociate them from it. And then it's a framing exercise using very specific language. And the emotion releases, that neural pathway releases. And basically, you're replacing that emotion with information so that unconsciously the brain is actually going to react to the information versus the emotion. And it's pretty remarkable to see somebody with high level of anxiety find that root, release the emotional connection to it, and then they're not anxious anymore. And it doesn't take very long to achieve that.
What does that actually look like? If I'm a patient coming to your clinic and you're going to walk me through the steps, what does that actually look like?
I think one of the first things that we generally will do is we want to find out how analytical you are. We want to rapport is big. So feeling comfortable. It's not about me or Dan or one of the coaches we've trained. It's about you and your experience. the first thing to understand is it's going to be a comfortable process. This is not talk therapy. What we do is not therapy. We don't know any details. Anything that you work on, we're not going to know about. And then we do a lot of questioning. We'll ask questions. Okay, we'll find those emotions. We'll find the roots. And we set the process up in a way that allows the person's brain to reprocess the information. This is the way I like to make sense of it for people. But essentially, we're going to allow you to set up the field or the scene for your subconscious brain to now reprocess the events that you've dealt with. And when the brain does, it goes, wait a minute, these are old memories and this stuff doesn't belong here. And it literally, if you think of the amygdala as that fight or flight part of your brain, imagine having a memory, one of your worst memories stuck in that part of your brain and having emotions attached to it, right? It's almost like a live wire. So you've got a memory and you've got emotions in completely the wrong part of the brain. That's why it's so debilitating. And it's not a psychological issue. It's a neurological issue. That's why our processes will work when you do it in the way that we do. I mean, I couldn't walk you through the whole thing right now. I don't think that would do a service to the folks.
Give me a snapshot. Like, is there hypnosis? I've heard of rapid eye movement.
Nope, it's no hypnosis or rapid eye movement. It's very different than other modalities. It's essentially, once we have the process, the imagery set up in the way we want, we're having you watch yourself in a disassociated way, right? So let's say you watch a movie on your couch, you're going to be watching yourself, but you're not the one watching the movie. The self on the couch is watching the movie. There's very specific language that we go into with that, but it allows the subconscious to go, oh, okay, excuse me. Now I know what's going on. Oh, wait, hold on. This doesn't belong here. It's kind of like it lets the system know, oh, this is a fault. We need to clear this fault. And it severs those emotional connections. And then the rewind piece where we go in a rapid direction backwards in time with specific language and wording again, it allows the brain to go, whoa, hold on a second. This doesn't belong in my amygdala. Like, this memory should be in my cerebellum. And that's why when we get done with the process, the person will go, think about that bad event again. Now, we don't know about it. You might have just called your bad event the woods. I don't know what happened in the woods. We'll say, look at the woods again. And you might have told us a couple minutes ago, it's a 10 on a scale of 0 to 10. And now you look at it and usually you get this really cool look.
It's a stress scale, 0 to 10?
Yeah, that's just the wording we use. 0 being nothing, 10's pretty intense. How strong do you feel it? So if the person we're working with says, oh, it's a 10 or it's a 20. Okay, by the time we're done and we say, look at the woods again, you get this really cool, funny look on their face. Usually it's this, wait, where is it? And they're looking all over. It's a confused look. And then you might get a smile. You might get a grief response where they get a little emotional, but they're like, it's not there. It's just a memory. And it really sets people free. So that's the part that I think that is, you said something earlier that I wanted to hit on. There's certain professions out there, right? Where you can't talk about, I can't sleep at night. I'm having night terrors. I need to drink myself to sleep. Whatever it may be, especially with post-traumatic stress and anxiety. If I asked you this question, and this is a little bit outside of the career field, but if I said, do you think that it is possible that every single pilot in the United States, I don't know how many there are total, but every single pilot in the United States that's actively flying airplanes, do you believe that not one single one of them has anxiety or post-traumatic stress? Is that possible?
I'm sure most people have anxiety, but differing levels of debilitation, of course.
Right. But get this. If you say you have anxiety, guess who can't fly an airplane anymore? So people are going to hide. No, I don't have that. I need my medical certificate. I need to be able to make a living for my family.
Right.
And again, it's not a psychological issue. It's neurological. So the more we can get that information out to people, and look, you can disconnect this stuff without discussing what you've been through. Because unfortunately, guys like Dan and myself, we've been through therapy before. I'm not knocking therapy. Like, we can be a counterpart to them, but the heavy lifting, the trauma and the anxiety, those big negative emotions, we can disconnect, which allows them to do the cognitive behavioral therapy. Because if I like you and you've been my therapist for years, I don't want to go talk to Dan and relive everything with him and tell him all the gory details about what I went through. And to be honest with you, that's not great for Dan either, because now he's hearing it and now he has to live with whatever happened to you as a child or what happened to you in your marriage or wherever it may be, or in combat. So essentially those processes are very safe and comfortable. And, we want people to be skeptical. We don't want you to go, oh, I believe you, and I'm just going to take your word for it. I was skeptical. Dan was skeptical. But the proof is in the pudding. When you go through the process, you will heal. you will know almost immediately in the first session that we've disconnected some big traumas.
Dan, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, so
if you want to jump in.
I wanted to say 220 has been in operation. April is going to be 5 years. And the level of work we do and the claims we make, that was one of Dr. Bequee's issues, the claims we were making at the beginning. I said, Phil, I stand behind every single one of them and we'll prove it, right? So we're now training police departments. We're training fire departments. We've trained members of the U.S. Border Patrol, military chaplains that are active duty. And that's the really cool part, because if we couldn't do what we claim to do, like Nick always says, we would have been crucified in the space 5 years ago. And that information just doesn't exist. We produced a documentary called Healing the Heroes of 9/11, The Way Forward. And we took 5 first responders from Ground Zero and the Pentagon. Their stories are incredible, unbelievable. And they've struggled for 20 years with PTSD. And then we did the work off camera, and then we brought them back and got their stories again. And we even had a psychologist reach out to us. We had a long conversation with retired law enforcement. He goes, I'm pretty good at reading people, and everybody in that documentary believed exactly what they went through. So he said, there's something to this. And then that psychologist got treated by 220 and had a total paradigm change. And he's working in that profession. So, the reality is what we are doing is disruptive to some industries, but that's not the intentions. We have one licensed professional counselor. He's a Vietnam veteran, retired cop, works in the Virginia Beach area. He's getting 5 or 6 clients a day to do trauma work, and he's been doing it for a year now. So he's always calling me up and giving me updates, and it's exciting to see that, because we need the therapy world has to understand they're the force multiplier. Clients are looking for them, right? We have to find our clients, or they come to us by that nonprofit space. But it's truly remarkable to literally watch somebody go through a process. And for me, I get giddy and excited because of the children that we're actually able to help. Because if you're a veteran or a first responder, active military, or you're a spouse, or you have a child, we'll work with the entire family through 220. And to see a child very quickly, kids are very quick to heal. What does that look like? And that's why had I had something like that when I was 11, my whole future would have been different, right? My whole trajectory would have been different. And that's the exciting part, is that this not only can help adults, but it can help children. And it doesn't matter where you are in that process. We've worked with World War II veterans that had PTSD, that have been struggling since, 1945, 44. We've worked with kids as young as 4. And it's truly life-changing to actually watch somebody. I know of several people that we've worked with who were actively suicidal or couldn't have children, now have had children. Their family trees are changing. That's generational. So I get giddy and excited when I think about the future of where we are in the space, because we are changing a paradigm and a belief structure on how we deal with trauma and anxiety and all the other issues. So it's super exciting.
That's where what Dan was just saying about the kids. We both love. I have 5 kids myself, from 23 all the way down to 5. We've worked with kids that have anxiety so bad they're passing out, and a couple of sessions later, no more anxiety, no more passing out, hanging out with their friends, going to school. We've done some podcasts on it. It's actually what caused us to form anxietyguys.com, because we had so many civilians coming to us. And people didn't qualify, and they were dismissing themselves. And it's like, well, you might not be a veteran or a first responder, but maybe your cousin or uncle was. That shouldn't mean you shouldn't be able to get treated. So that was part of our goal with the for-profit side, was to take some of what we're making and start funding the nonprofit, as well as funding treatment centers, where we can really expand what we're doing, so people understand there is a way to do this. It's not a lifelong sentence. It doesn't need to be medicated. And give us a shot. And if it doesn't work, then try something else. But we haven't had somebody that didn't work for yet. So
and you haven't had anything where it backfired and somebody felt worse after the treatment? Okay.
No, we're not talking about details, right? So we're not going into any details. The way we run the process is that you might feel a little bit of the emotion, and we're not even talking about it again. We never know a single detail. So no, we unless Dan wants to say different, which I know he won't, because we're together all the time, but it's a very safe, comfortable process. And that's usually the feedback we get. Some people are really nervous or scared because they've held something or dealt with it for just so long. they can't imagine what life might be like without, it's almost like the enemy, I will tell you this, we have not worked with a single person out of thousands and thousands of people that have said, hey, can you give me my trauma back? Can you give me my anxiety back? I like the way I used to be better. They might be a little fuzzy the first day or two when they're like, oh my God, everything's not firing all at the same time. But after a couple of days, they're like, man, I feel so good. And then they go on with their life. And like Dan said, have kids and start new jobs and go into new careers. And it's just, we feel blessed that we get to do this. Our goal was to become irrelevant. 22-0, Dan, I got to give so much credit to, because there's people like, oh, we could do this business and we could do that. And from the get-go, it was like, no, it's not about money. It's about saving lives. And we've had a lot of friends we've lost. And Dan held true to that mission. I always held true to it. I didn't care about the money. I just want to save people's lives. And we got to a point where 22-0 was very self-sufficient. We've got a lot of great coaches. We got great people on the board. We got great supporters out there, and things are really taking off. And that's where we started to really pivot to the anxiety guy side, the civilian side, because I think it just brings more awareness. There's more civilians than there are first responders and veterans. So if we can get that group of people on board, it's all over. Look out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that you were also treating civilians. I'm kind of, we could talk about it offline, but I'm in touch with some psychotrauma centers in Israel. And as you know, because of the ongoing conflict, these psychotrauma centers are not just dealing with soldiers with PTSD, but with civilians, especially in the south of the country that see regular rocket fire, and including children. I just had one more question about the treatment. So I know that you don't stop people, obviously, from, speaking to a counselor, doing talk therapy. It sounds like both of you have tried different types of therapy. And I know, Dan, that you had a very negative experience with prolonged exposure therapy, but I'm just kind of curious, if somebody is coming to you with some trauma, like a complex trauma, and I mean, is there a downside to just doing your treatment and not doing any talk therapy at all? I understand it's not like offered as part of your buffet, but let's say somebody says, well, I'm not going to do any talk therapy at all. I'm just going to do, the 22-0 program. I mean, is there a downside to that?
So we've had folks come to us that have been in treatment for decades, and then they run through our processes and literally changes their whole worldview. And then they get upset at the therapy world because they've had to deal with this for such a long period of time. Mm-hmm. And what we tell them is that world doesn't even know what we do. And if you told them, they would have a hard time believing it because they've been professionally trained, academically trained, licensed. So there's a profession that, hey, they want a lot of evidence and a lot of data. I personally don't have time to wait for data because I've lost more buddies to suicide coming home from the war than we've lost in the war. And that's got to stop. So for me, it's deeply personal. I don't need that evidence-based treatment, but you got to realize if you're a veteran, maybe you're 20 years with PTSD, you've isolated. That's when we tell them, hey, look, you should probably go do some therapy right now so that you can actually figure out how to re-engage society, how to restore relationships with your family, restore relationships with your kids. Hey, maybe you've not held a job for a while. Now you got to go get vocational training. How do I get back to work? So we don't discourage anything. And as a matter of fact, there's folks, what we'll do is when the veterans come to us and they're healed up, if they want therapy outside of the VA, then we'll refer them to another nonprofit that'll fund treatment and they can actually get counseling. It's just one piece of the continuation or a continuum of care. It's not a silver bullet and you don't want to do that. But there are some people that they may make a decision not to seek therapy afterwards, and that's fine. But PTSD in itself for the events that occurred are not psychological. Right? You can develop psychological problems over time based on the behaviors you've been experiencing in that time frame. But we don't discourage it. But it's really the decision of the client whenever they're finished doing the neurological intervention, whether they want to go do the psychological.
Jessica, I think I would add to that if you think about when people do have childhood trauma or stuff from your past, maybe you had a rough upbringing. If you have a lot of trauma from earlier in your life and now you're 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, a lot of times you're like, why are you acting like a 12-year-old? Why are you acting like a 6-year-old, right? To some extent, you stop developing, right, at those earlier ages because you kind of go into this protection mode. You got all that trauma. What we do will absolutely, it saves lives all the time. So I'd love to be the first stop for us, what we do, because it cuts out that big, heavy stuff, the stuff that makes you go, it's not that I want to die. I don't want to exist anymore. I don't want to hurt anymore. I don't want to feel this anymore. We shut that off. We get now you can go back and start learning how to communicate better, heal your marriage. I went through marriage counseling in the past, and there is a lot of benefit there. What we really try to hold out and focus specifically on is PTS, and usually the worse it is, the easier it is for us to disconnect it, as crazy as that sounds. That anxiety and those negative emotions like anger, sadness, guilt, survivor guilt, shame, those can be disconnected rapidly. Usually it's 2 to 3 sessions on average for us with the people we work with to disconnect all of that. Sometimes it's a little more depending on how analytical somebody is, but we don't want to be adversarial. We don't need to be. Dr. PQ is somebody that we partnered with, talked to. It's a lot of good conversation. I think we owe it to the people we serve to check our ego and our pride at the door and go, what's working, right? Is this working? Because people's lives are at stake. This isn't about opinions and whose widget is better. It's about saving lives. And that's really, I think, when you get to the brass tacks, that's where Dan and I stand on it. And we're happy to engage with people that are, have the same heart and passion to heal others, which I think a lot in the mental health professional world do have that heart to serve and heal others.
My last quick question is, and then I have to run and pick up my children from school. So my last question is, what is your message of hope for somebody who is suffering right now with PTSD? I brought this up with other security professionals. I'm very interested, by the way, in the stigma of mental health in the security field as well. And there are practical considerations for potentially losing a security clearance. What is your message of hope for somebody who really is struggling with PTSD and is afraid to come forward and seek treatment?
So that was my issue when I was still on active duty, right? Do I ask for help? Do I self-refer? Do I use EAP? The sad part of that was suicide became a better option than asking for help, right? Because the stigma that is attached to it. We know what our bosses, our commanders think about it, all right? Some of them are becoming more open-minded because they realize, hey, there's something to this. Because in the United States military, the highest rates of suicide is our special operations. That's the strongest of the men we have. Right, or the women that work in those fields that we have, we don't have anything stronger than that. So it's got nothing to do with how strong or weak you are as a person. All I can say is it's not a life sentence. You do not have to live with PTSD. It is not a disorder. It's an injury. There is no harm in coming and asking. And that's why we created 220 to work with active duty, because we can work with them and they go right back to work. And nobody even knows that they came to us. Same thing with law enforcement officers that are scared. Because you mentioned PTSD, and many of the senior level administrators in law enforcement, they look at that as a liability problem. It's neurological. Right. It is not. Your body and your brain has experienced a very abnormal event, and it reacted normally to it. Your foot just got stuck on the gas pedal, right? And it doesn't have to stay there. We can help you take your foot off that gas pedal. It is not a life sentence. You can literally get your life back and be that person that you're meant to be.
Jessica, you have children, and I would say to you, if one of your kids broke their leg and need like severe broken leg, would you tell them they need to go run the Boston Marathon tomorrow? You take them to the hospital and you get their leg fixed, correct? This is an injury. And you should not expect yourself to be able to play through an injury, especially when it's your brain, because it needs to heal. That's what our processes do. They allow you to heal without anybody knowing that you came to us. We're not keeping your medical records. We're not disclosing your medical records. It is all very private between us, and we're not keeping your data and sharing it with others. If you want to share your story, that's up to you. So if you're skeptical, give us a call. Dan and I's information is out there for everybody. We share our cell phone numbers with people and our email addresses. We want people to call and ask questions because it might just save somebody's dad or mom or child. And losing somebody you love at that level is not fun. So worst you got to do is have a conversation with one of us so we can explain it a little deeper and level with you.
Thank you so much for sharing this valuable information. I'm definitely looking forward to sharing it with others. Just keep up the great work.
Thank you. We appreciate